All right, I'd like to first start off with acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land that include the Gadigal people upon the Eora Nation, um, the land upon which this presentation was actually developed. We acknowledge that social work has been a particularly instrumental part of the disenfranchisement of Aboriginal peoples in Torres Strait Islanders. And therefore, I commit the whole profession, I commit all of us to rectifying and readdressing this through the education, through the enhancement and well-being of all peoples. So what I like to do first, because I see people on their phone right now, and that's all right, because I'm about meeting people where they are, and sorry, I kind of moved from the mic, my basketball history. Could everyone please feel free to QR code in? You're going to be taken to a site. Some of you may have used Socrates before. It's an interactive polling application. As one of the talk about positionality, the positions I come from is about meeting people where we're at. And I feel that, having been a student, having been a practitioner, a clinician, a peer worker, as well as an academic, monologues and one-way streets often don't work with, enhancing knowledge and understanding with people. So this is about engaging you and meeting you where you're at. So if your QR code doesn't work, then just go to this website here, Socrates.com. It'll ask for student login, or go to the student login, and then just enter the room number. Sorry, it's actually quite low. QCWUADDYZ. But if you've done the QR code, it should take you right there. Is that right? I'm a kind of short, compact guy, so this is pretty good eye level for me. Look, because I know we're kind of critical on time, I'd like everyone who wants to participate, if we can get everyone in, that's fine. Otherwise, feel free to chum along with your partner next to you. Sheridan? So we can go to that screen now? All right, so the first question asks, have you ever experienced discrimination because of culture, background, or ethnic heritage? So true, false, or yes, no?
What about 6?
Sorry?
What about 6?
It's coming. I had that in mind when we were making this. All right, this is good. We have about 76 folks. We can go to the next one. Have you ever felt discriminated against because of your gender or sexual orientation? Again, this is about positionality, correct? What position we may hold, how do we identify? You can go to the next one. Have you ever experienced racism or perceived that you were discriminated against because of your color? Yeah, however it may apply, sister. So, it can be in any of those capacities because you have a position that varies throughout your day, your year, your life. So however you perceive it, however you understand it, however you experience it, let it apply. Okay, next one. Here's kind of an empirical question. Race has a strong genetic loading component and is therefore best understood as a biological construct. That's probably quite academic. I mean, I could break that down a bit. Do you believe that race, and again, you can't tell American accent, I'm from north of the equator. Actually, I was born in Perth, and I watched a lot of American TV, and the accent rubbed off. Yeah. All right. That it's in our biology, it's in our genes, this idea of race. That we have a race or ethnicity, and it's genetic predisposed for us. What do you say? Experiencing race or ethnic discrimination has an impact on mental well-being, but not necessarily physical. Racism is a natural phenomenon that occurs when groups of people from different backgrounds get together.
Can we see the results?
We're coming. You're ahead of me. Okay. Next one. As a peer worker, being fair and just with my indigenous or my called patients or consumers, that is, not being racist myself, is more important than being aware of political and historical influences of racism. English is the official language of Australia. Three more. Sheridan. While it is an important issue to understand racism, it cannot be measured. Now I know these questions. Well, I'll mention this after. All right, next one. Compared to members of majority population, members of a racial ethnic minority communities, and then you have multiple choice questions, are more likely to engage in healthcare services, somewhat likely to manifest mental health resilience, tend to be more socioeconomically disadvantaged, tend to be more social politically advantaged. All of the above. And then lastly, social inequalities in indigenous and called health associated with discrimination have been linked to which of the following outcomes in the empirical literature? So cardiovascular disease, depression, smoking, all the above. Now I know that in this kind of setting, we probably are likely to be subject to this thing called social desirability. Therefore, it's anonymous one. Hopefully you weren't looking over each other's shoulder to see what each other's responses were. But the answers may in fact change based upon the context that we're in. If we're having a casual conversation out on the street in the park over there, answers might be a little bit different. So I want you to keep that in mind. Sheridan, if we can go all the way back to the first one now. So yeah, there you go. Show results. You on it. All right. So here we go. So disregard the true and false. It's more about not right or wrong, but yes or no. Okay? So over a third of us in the room have experienced some form of discrimination or perceived having been unfairly treated as a result of our ethnic or cultural heritage. The next one. Okay. 3/4 have felt discriminated against because of gender. All right. Next. Perceived discriminated against because of color. All right. Just a bit under 40%. So, a lot of us believe that more than half, that genetic loading or biological construct is not an accurate understanding or portrayal of this idea of race. Okay? Very nice. So a strong majority suggests that it does have an impact on both mental and physical well-being. Okay? And again, here we're looking at the idea that it's not a natural phenomenon, that people don't necessarily, just because we come together, we all of a sudden have discriminatory dispositions towards one another. And a good example of this is children. The only thing they discriminate against is who's got the most toys, right? Now, if you got blonde hair, blue eyes, or you got brown or black skin, right? Wow, that's interesting. Does someone want to comment on that one?
Yep.
Please.
Yeah, they're both very important, so I can imagine people being torn between which one to focus on, like the person you're working with or their background.
And look, we tend to think, and I want, again, this part of this is really a reflection, a space for reflecting about ourselves and our own thinking, and our social, cultural, and historical elements that influence all of us, how we think, what we do, and how we do it. The idea of being, again, positionality. It's important to understand the knowing, the being, and the doing, and what we do, right? Whether that's living our daily lives, working in a peer worker capacity or clinical capacity, in a health capacity, as a support worker, and so forth. Okay? Official language of Australia. There you go, right? It is not. If you could please, Sheridan, show explanation below, if you tick that. So, factual error, Australia does not have an official language, right? English is the default national language of Australia, and this was brought to the forefront when in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal Minister Bess Nungari Price was denied the request to speak her local language. And there's more details on this. I'm willing to share the details on that if people so desire. I did have others, but again, being conscious of time. The other ones around biological construct and so forth, I actually have references for this. Going back to the Human Genome Project that was conducted many years ago, that found that there is more genetic difference between people of the same racial ethnic background than there is between people of different ethnic racial backgrounds. Okay? The next one. It's important to understand racism, and it cannot be measured again. This is not necessarily true. If we click the explanation, I believe I've got something there yet. So, same one as the last one. Well, that probably is important to note. Yeah, it is not the official language of Australia. One of my colleagues and mentors back in the States, Dr. David Williams and team at Harvard have done a lot of work around this area, and they've in fact been able to show that racism and discrimination, beyond perceived discrimination, because a lot of the research that was done prior to the 90s, even the National Institutes of Health and funding bodies told researchers, you can't call it racism, you can't even call it discrimination. You have to say perceived, because it's all in people's head, right? We've since been able to go beyond that and actually show that there is a definitive, without question, impact that this has not only on mental but physical and even spiritual well-being. Okay? So it can be measured. Interesting. All right, we've got a spattering across. All of these, again, the wording is probably a bit of the twist there. So as Pam, you mentioned earlier, the idea of language is quite important. But when we think about the idea of being more social-economically disadvantaged, this is quite important because, again, when we do the work that we do, we have to take into account not necessarily what people are presenting with, but how they're presenting. And oftentimes they present under socioeconomic distress. And we may not necessarily consider that they may not have brought it to the forefront, but it has a significant impact beyond what the presenting issue of concern may be. Again, inequalities in the indigenous and called communities associated with discrimination tend to be linked to all the above. So not just cardiovascular, not just depression and anxiety, and not just risk factors or certain behaviors such as smoking. Thank you for your participation. Have a good day. Oh, no, that's not it. A little bit more. Next slides, please. We got to put further context into that. But thank you again for your participation, and hopefully that opens up for a bit of a more of a dialogue here with the remainder of the discussion. So, as the title suggests, the idea of positionality, using theory and research to understand our position, the position of the people that we work with, is quite essential to the work that we do. I'm not sure how many folks have had, certain level of formal education. To me, street is all the education we sometimes need, right? I was saying where I come from, I've been educated by the streets, all right? And it's important because it ain't always where you're from, it's where you're at. You can go to school and get umpteen degrees, but they're like tombs of books on the back of an animal that can't read them. Translated application, being able to apply that knowledge, being able to meet people where they're at and keeping it real. So I want to, within that context, just run through the idea of how theories can be used, as nasty as it might sound, in research, and that those other academic terms actually can have practicality. And one of my challenges in academia has been to pull those researchers and those academics out into the real world space in an effort to really meet people where they're at. Because one of the things, I'll tell you a quick story. I'm in the process of having to move right now because I got a notice about 30 days ago. Get out with no excuse, I think they wanted to rob me of my veggie patch in the back. But I was pulling out all these papers from theses and research that I had done over the years, and a lot of it was on mental health, drug and alcohol. And they're sitting there collecting mold and all this stuff, and I'm like, why am I collecting all of this? And has this stuff actually benefited the people that I work with? So I began to have this purgative, reflective moment as I'm pulling stuff out of the garage, getting upset because I've collected it, but starting to think, wow, this weight on it, is it as heavy as the weight of the people that are sick and dying out there? And have I been of any benefit to them in the process? So I, with renewed motivation, started kicking all the papers out and said, this stuff, look, it has some relevance, but it's only as good as the paper it's written on if we cannot put it into beneficial practice. So in that stuff was a lot of theories, but theories ideally are a framework that we use to link ideas, to be able to connect some concepts, some phenomenon that we may observe in the real world with this thing called practice, or this thing called peer support. The stuff that we do, because we can do a lot of it from our heart and feel good about it, but if it doesn't have some kind of structure, if it doesn't have some kind of mechanism and methodology to it, then it too is no more valuable than the words that we speak that have nothing but air, right? So we sometimes may develop these to, again, explain phenomenon in the real world. This idea that critical theory, which was developed back in the 70s, when in the U.S. there was a lot of hate around this idea of race and racism and discrimination. It points out the fact that there are a lot of different power structures that exist in our society that create these domains, that create these edifices and these constructs that we have to kind of put things into categories and boxes. One of those, again, going back to this idea of language, which I love so much, is this idea of mental illness or mental health or well-being and so forth. What do we mean by those? What do we mean by this idea of discrimination? What do we mean by race? So the question that was asked earlier is race a biological phenomenon, or is it a social construct? Is this something that we designed so that we can, because we kind of have this bit of categorical pleasures, I guess. We like to put things in box, put shoes in box, we put jewelry in box, we put Legos in boxes, and we put people in boxes, right? And we put the square frame around them, and what does that do? It constricts, it restricts. Someone else said something? Yeah, compartmentalize. And if you so I can't even say it, right? Compartmentalize me, what does that do to my thinking? I think in the box. And I have a really nice cartoon, I didn't bring it. But I got a guy who's standing next to a cat, and there's a litter box. He says, don't think outside the box. I think that's what we do in society quite often, right? Through these social constructs. So not only are the people that we may work with, the people that are seeking treatment, and us as the treatment providers, we think inside these boxes, and we never come out. Theories can be an advantage or disadvantage to that. So hopefully today, what I intend to do is to be able to help us not only think outside the box, but understand and benefit and maximize the potential that something like a theory or a construct has in doing the work that we do. So critical race theory, this idea of the self-research, really understanding ourself, our relationship to others. I have no doubt that everyone in here has some research bone in your body. You probably did it to get here today like you did, or maybe to purchase your latest phone or your computer or your car or your partner. You've done some research on these matters, right? And it does matter, right? But it's also a space for reflection and understanding, again, not only what we do, but how we do it. How do we put ourselves into the systems? How do we self-categorize or self-compartmentalize? Yeah? But I put to you that we can use some theories to guide us around developing frameworks, particularly in ethnic and racial disparities and cultural awareness. Because this, again, brings us back to our own sense of conscious positionality. Again, why we did that 11-question survey was to get us to think consciously about where am I positioned in this society? And what is that in relation to the people that I work with? Whether colleagues, peers, consumers, and so forth. Again, what is my racial, ethnic, and cultural heritage? And just ticking the box previously is not enough. So I don't want to in any way minimize that, because for me, and I suspect for you, culture is quite amorphous. It really has no shape. Therefore, it's not subject to being able to be put in a box. All right? It's quite free-flowing. It's fluid. It's constantly changing. See, most of us in here are of a certain age, but we know little people, otherwise known as children. They are evolving another culture. You know, I've got a colleague, a psychiatrist who does work in child psychiatry, and he was part of the advisory group for the DSM-4, DSM-5, a categorical box from hell, right? That looked at problem internet use and gaming. And one of the interesting things that he found was that on average, again, we're genderizing, stereotyping here, but when it came to having interacted with devices, boys tend to do this, and girls tend to swipe, right? It's very interesting. If you look at the children, perhaps you might see some of these. Where is the social construction coming from? Where is the technical construction evolving the next culture in this regard, the next generation's culture? So again, how do I negotiate and balance my own stuff in the broader context? All right? So there's a lot of these how do I know questions. And again, if we were in an extended seminar, we'd actually workshop some of these things, similar to how we did earlier, because this is important to put out, you know, on the table, literally or personally, pragmatically. How do I answer these questions? How do I see myself? You know, the saying that we look in the mirror, but we don't see ourselves like others do. Right now, you all see probably this black guy with large nostrils with a funny accent, halfway funny, but where is he coming from? But my question is, where am I going? Right? Are we in a position to understand that for the person that we're engaging and the person we're working with? What do I understand about the cultural nuances and the realities that help shape my own sense and my own perception of self? And again, in relation to others, because when we're working with that person next to us, they're going to see someone different, right? So I want to then, again, I'll share these slides publicly because this gets a bit deep inside the social construction. But the point is that there's a relative term, an idea to what we construct in our society. In Australian society, even though you speak English, it's different to the U.S. and American society. I remember when I first came to Australia about 13 years ago, and it was just like this time of the year, and it was pretty cold and chilly and stuff, and I had like 4 luggage suitcases, and my brother-in-law is like, okay, we're out in the car park. Hey, just put that in the boot. I'm like, what? How you gonna put all that stuff in a boot, right? A shoe, you know? And it was raining. Hey, put the windscreen on. The windscreen? It's a windshield, you know? Did you get a jumper? A jump rope? No, man, I'm going to get in the car, all right? So we might assume that language, we speak the same stuff, but actually the terminology and the concept and the meaning can be quite different, all right? So how do we know if we're on the same page is the point. Again, some concepts around strengths-based, respect, dignity and such. How do we define these terms? Do we define them relative to the social constructs and the positionality that define who we are? Or is it broader enough to embrace those around us? Yeah? Do we incidentally/accidentally discriminate against people, against others? All right? Again, we could talk about it from a media perspective. How does media theorize the idea of human dignity or gender or human rights? Yeah? I still am a bit flabbergasted, y'all would call it bamboozled, hoodwink, how even in 2022, we still have significant levels of health disparities and social economic disparities with Indigenous First Nations people, right? I work at Campbelltown Hospital, and I see it coming through quite often. Not only that, with the domestic violence and the mental health and the drug and alcohol issues, right? The audacity of a doctor to assume that this 22-year-old mother who's brought in her 6-year-old child with a suspected fracture, it was non-accidental injury. And they got taken through the ringer, and within a day, massive apologies were occurring because it wasn't a fracture, right? But the assumptions that went on, and of course she and her mother stated it. You're just doing this because we're black, because we're indigenous, all right? So, again, cultural differences and so forth. Foucault, if you really want to go into the theory and the sociological ramifications of such. But let's go here. Let's talk about how might the theory and the conceptual framework around suicidality help us to understand and meet people where they're at. And before I go further, I just want to acknowledge again the wisdom, the knowledge, the experience that's in the room, and the fact that we all have sensitivities. And I want to be conscious to those sensitivities as well. But I also want to identify the courage and the strengths that exist in the room, individually and collectively, such that we can go through this stuff, you know, in a way to gain a higher understanding. So when we think about the idea that service quality improvement can be driven by theoretical and conceptual frameworks, okay, we've arrived. How can we do this when we say, for instance, look at the comorbidity between suicidal ideation and mental health, or drug and alcohol, substance use? There's quite a bit of research around this idea, which brings it to another kind of interesting political quagmire in Australia, because when I came here, again in around 2009, there was a point where you had mental health policy unit, and then you had the drug and alcohol policy up in Gladesville, and you had the what do you call them, the administrator, and then they became Medeo. They combined, and then they separated, got divorced again. And I don't understand, you know. I think we do it in the U.S. a little bit too, but we got it. We got NICE, the National Institute for Co-occurring Excellence, and they have the same thing in the UK as well. How can you conceptually separate, well, not you, but them, I guess, how do they conceptually and justify separating the two? And again, where I see the problem is in the emergency department of any given hospital, you can take it. If a person comes in presenting with a mental health issue, but they had a little alcohol or something else on board, oh, well, until they get sober, that's a drug and alcohol issue. Give them a ticket, and we'll come back later. And mental health comes in, oh, we're cleared for mental health right now. They're not meeting the suicide threshold, so okay, and then they yell at each other when no one responds, so you call the social worker, because they're homeless. And I don't deal with the patient. I go and scream at the clinicians, you know. So that's why I'm on long service leave right now. So anyway, so we have a very strong, a very robust model and theory here. It's called the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. This was developed by an individual named Thomas Joyner back in 2011, and I came across this during my tenure working as the ATAPS 2 coordinator for suicide at St. George Community Mental Health. And part of my, recognition that I needed to skill myself up, I delved into the literature and the research, and I came up with Joyner's work. And I encourage you, if you can, just do an internet search, otherwise it was a Google search, co-optation there. And look at some of the videos that he's got presented. It's pretty good. I will warn you, and he warns you, that some of it can be graphic, because he shows some videos of people who've attempted, but he talks you through what's happening there. But I found this theory quite robust, because there's two primary constructs that are involved and explained. One is this thwarted sense of belongingness, and the other is this overwhelming sense of burdensomeness. Essentially that people feel I'm an excess load on those around me or my community or my society, and that I don't belong, right? And this really provides a strong rationale for the evidence base. How do we intervene? How do we meet people where they're at and talk about this, right? What he also does in this work is he does a lot of myth busting, right? This idea, the fact that stigma occurs because of fear and ignorance. And again, we've been talking about things like racism and discrimination. Those two things operate largely on this idea of fear. Because here's another word that's out there, prejudice, right? What's the root word for prejudice? To judge, right? Prejudge. So judge without information, judge without evidence. I was in the military back when I was in the U.S., and I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I used to do some crazy things like jump out of perfectly good aircraft at 30 in the morning. And I had a staff sergeant who was our leader, basically. I call him a peerless fear leader. He was a white guy, and it was me and another Sergeant Littlejohn. We were the only black guys in our platoon. And obviously we were working together for 4 years, so we could have some kind of casual talk. This guy shared with us the fact that we were the first black people he'd ever talked with, he ever met. And we're all in our 20s and 30s. I don't know if you've ever watched American TV. Again, be careful, the accent might rub off. But there was a program called Good Times. And there was this guy called JJ. He was a buffoon. And we could talk about history and television and how it perpetuates stereotypes. JJ was a fool, right? He was lazy, he was uneducated, and so forth. Well, Sergeant Winger, my staff sergeant, that's all he knew about black folks, right? And I had just done a bit of my uni. Back in the U.S., you know, you get to the third, fourth year and you can't finish because you couldn't pay, so you join the military so you can get a college fund and be able to support your college year after. But I didn't know I ended up in 2 conflict tours and war thereafter. But Sergeant Winger actually shared with us his thinking. And because I was a little bit educated, he was like, wow, you actually use words that I don't even know. And you're not like JJ. Of course not. You know, we can think a little bit, yeah. So it's quite interesting because you can be standing next to someone or you could be standing next to yourself with a lot of prejudged isses that diss other people. So being aware of that. But again, what does it underscore? This idea of stigma. And it's driven by fear. So the model suggests that this thwarted sense of belongingness, I am alone, and this perceived burdensomeness, I am a burden, it overlaps to the point that we call the critical or lethality point, where the desire for suicide is quite strong. When people may endorse or feel that these are in fact reflective of them and their position, then they often will endorse or articulate or suggest that I'm feeling like I want to check out, that I don't want to be here. The capability or the capacity for suicide, what we often will ask in the emergency department, access to means, comes into play. And that's where you have this really critical point right here, where the lethality, near lethality for suicide attempt is quite clear. And this is a high risk point. So again, a bit of the research underscored by the theory allows us to then tap on to these constructs here and be able to see where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses. Where might the resilience be? Seasonal variation. That's an important one, right? People are aware that there's certain seasons of the year when this potential sense of lack of belonging might be higher. When would that be? Winter, Christmas, holidays, birthday, marriage, divorce, anniversaries.
Around anniversaries too.
Absolutely, yes, right? So that might increase in drive, loneliness. Or if it's strength, pulling together, it might actually decrease that sense of loneliness. But on the other side, sense of belonging. So things like domestic violence, jail cell, single jail in particular. So here we're talking about what? Solitary confinement. But also, if we think about going back, because I apologize, I haven't really linked the themes together, maybe as well as I should have. When we think about racism, discrimination, we think about in custody deaths for Aboriginal peoples, right? And I had one person I was working with who was actually in charge of those investigations, an Aboriginal man who was also part of Stolen Generation. So we can think about the historical things and things like child abuse that actually can increase some of these factors. That if we go further and we look at some of the other things around burdensomeness and so forth, again, unemployment, incarceration, homelessness can be factors that enhance this. But there are also other mechanisms that we can use or to intervene with to actually reduce the likelihood of one feeling in that way. Again, this idea of acquired ability, mentioned there, elevated physical pain tolerance. People can actually, and Thomas Joyner's articulation around this is just so profound. Because again, in the myth busting, he identifies ideas that people who say that, someone who does that, they're a coward. Actually, it's the opposite. Because what keeps all of us alive? Fear. For someone who goes into that space, they have overcome the natural instinct of survivability and wanting to keep themselves alive. It's a very, very powerful thing to think about. All right, rolling 1 minute. I'm getting ready to run out the room now. So all of it bringing together, I want to then bring it back to the idea of suicide and racism and how the pain of discrimination can be greater than the will to live, right? So we can reframe this by understanding those social, cultural, political, historical elements that might inform people's thinking and their sense of positionality. Where am I in this space? You know, do I belong? You know, am I an enhancement and not a burden? Right? Frederick Douglass, a great Aboriginal, or he was actually partly Aboriginal as well, but African American revolutionist in the U.S. that also reminds us of this willingness to want to continue and to strive despite the circumstances. Right? Racism is a fundamental determinant of health. It can be negatively associated with well-being. Conscious awareness of our own cultural and social dynamics and positioning is essential to peer work, and identifying and using theories and research in such a way that they become our lens for understanding and informing our practice and our approach can be key. And lastly, the lived experience that we have needs to be informed and guided by these lenses, because sometimes we need to look in the mirror, but through a lens of optimism and positivity, you know, to be truly effective in working with others. And my last summary page is that this approach requires, again, that informed lens and the understanding that we can continue to learn and recognize those things that we need to help others in helping themselves, and to meet people where they're at. Thank you.